Welcome to another installment of Behind the Comic Strip Curtain. In this episode, we look at why comic book creator Steve Ditko was critical of the credits he received at Marvel during the 1960s, even after he received a regular plotting credit. Although he is perhaps still best known as an artist, Steve Ditko's contributions at Marvel went well beyond those normally associated with comic book illustrators. This was already evident in 1961, when he was working with writer-editor Stan Lee on the anthology title, Amazing Adult Fantasy. Briefly, in regards to our working method, Stan provided the plot ideas. There would be a discussion to clear up anything, consider options and so forth. I would then do the panel/page breakdowns, pencil the visual story continuity and, on a separate piece of paper, provide a very rough panel dialogue, merely as a guide for Stan. Stan would provide the finished dialogue for the character, ideas and consistency. This general approach would carry on as Ditko moved to the increasingly popular superhero strips. During the creation of Spider-Man's origin in Amazing Fantasy No. 15, dated August 1962, Ditko worked from a written outline, or synopsis, provided by Lee. According to Ditko's later commentaries, Lee's synopses were employed as late as Amazing Spider-Man No. 14, July 1964. They were also used for their Hulk and early Doctor Strange collaborations. In a series of commentaries written decades later, Ditko would describe his role during this period as that of an artist plus, since he had to do more than simply follow the story directions normally provided in a standard full script. A synopsis is a brief storyline, words, abstractions, and so is incomplete, not detailed, not the whole story. A comic book synopsis does not tell or show the what, how and why for every panel and exactly how each character should act, react in every situation. The synopsis does not tell or show how to create the visually important, especially in dramatic scenes, in fight scenes, and how they are to be staged. With a synopsis, there is an actual need for more than an illustrator, and even more than an artist. A synopsis must have an artist plus. An artist plus has to take what is incomplete, what is partly provided, and add new story ideas, fill in, expand, provide everything else needed to make a complete, whole, work/picture story. Ditko's creative contributions were an integral element from the very beginning of Marvel's superhero renaissance. On Spider-Man he created the costume and many other defining aspects of the character. With regard to Doctor Strange, it was Ditko who initially conceptualized the character and plotted the first story, though the name was provided by Lee. Over time, Lee ceased providing written synopses for Spider-Man as Ditko gained greater narrative control. Story ideas were instead developed through discussions, as exemplified by the first Amazing Spider-Man annual. Eventually, Ditko assumed full plotting responsibilities for both Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. His control over the storylines became complete when Stan Lee reportedly withdrew from direct interactions, just prior to Ditko commencing work on Amazing Spider-Man No. 25. From this point on, Stan Lee wrote the dialogue and narration based purely on Ditko's penciled art and rough notes. This lasted until late 1965, when Ditko left Marvel. His final Spider-Man story appeared in issue No. 38, dated July 1966. In later years Ditko would publicly reflect on his experiences at Marvel in a series of commentaries. In doing so, he took a pragmatic view of the fact that he retained no ownership of his conceptual contributions. Ditko seemingly took a similar view with regard to the amount of remuneration he received. The subject went largely unmentioned in his essays, and was explicitly dismissed in at least one fan letter. But while he evidently didn't see himself as having been exploited by Marvel, Ditko would express strong feelings about how his work was credited in the publications themselves. In particular, Ditko took issue with the wording of Lee's credit boxes, which began to appear regularly in Marvel comics dated from late 1962. Lee had used these to inform readers of the creative teams on each story, at a time when many comic creators still produced material anonymously. Initial credits were brief and basic. Lee described his own role in various ways, using terms such as script by, written by, or story by, while Ditko was similarly acknowledged for his artwork. This approach changed after the two men ceased direct communication. At that point Ditko began receiving a specific plotting credit in Amazing Spider-Man number 25, with the Doctor Strange strip following a short time later. Regardless of whether they referenced his plotting contributions or not, none of Lee's credit formulations apparently met with Ditko's approval. Years later, he dismissed them all as examples of creative crediting. There's a long list of Lee's creative crediting style: script, Stan Lee; art, Steve Ditko; written by Stan Lee and plotted, drawn by Steve Ditko; script and editing by Stan Lee and illustrated by Steve Ditko. None are consistent in fact and actual meaning, and so all are non-objective, untrue. The crux of Ditko's argument was that he believed Lee's credits, even after the plotting credit was included, misled readers into thinking he was an artist working from a traditional full script provided by Lee. For this reason, the word script presented a particular problem. Whereas Lee used it to refer to the dialogue he wrote, a perspective that he reinforced in many of his interviews, Ditko firmly associated it with the full script method, in which all the story direction was provided for the artist to work from. Just as importantly, Ditko believed that readers would make this same association. Ditko's concerns were not, however, restricted to that specific term. Other variations of Lee's credits were included in the same criticism. All of these combinations of Stan's credits of scripted by, script and editing by, and written by etc., are all claiming, implying, a full script by Lee. Lee's creative crediting style claimed, that I was only following what he fully scripted for every panel and that I was only just illustrating. For Ditko, this was not a difference in how the terminology was interpreted, but rather a deliberate attempt to deceive readers and diminish the contributions of himself and other artists in his situation. Lee's method served to unfairly upgrade him and downgrade others in what they achieved. It was done simply, easily, by his choice, by his way of identifying credit words, using false labels. Although Ditko made no public comments concerning credits while working for Marvel, he reportedly expressed his personal frustration to at least one other person during that time. Comics creator Dick Giordano would recall visiting Ditko's studio in late 1965. If the timing of their interaction was being recalled accurately, then regular plotting credits would already have been in place. Even so, Giordano remembered Ditko being angry that the scripts were being attributed to Lee. I was visiting his New York studio while he angrily insisted that he, not Stan Lee, was writing the scripts for Spider-Man. To make his point, he indicated a chart on the wall that clearly outlined the Spider-Man storyline for the next 3 or 4 issues. Stan, of course, did write the dialogue, but Steve, rightly or wrongly, still insisted that he should get scripting credit. Neither agreeing or disagreeing with Steve's contentions, I didn't pursue the matter at the time because I felt it was inappropriate to get involved, but a short time later Steve severed his ties with Marvel. There was no mention in Giordano's account of Ditko having approached Stan Lee about the matter, and by that point the two were no longer on speaking terms. This naturally leads to the question of whether Ditko ever voiced his concerns about the credits directly to Lee while they were still communicating. With respect to the public commentaries of Ditko and Lee, there is nothing to suggest that credits were even discussed between the two. In the case of Steve Ditko, This is particularly noteworthy, since he described his dissatisfaction of the credits in some depth, while also recording numerous disagreements and interactions with Lee that he obviously considered as important for the historical record. Stan Lee's recollections of their working relationship were often more general than Ditko's, but he did remember specific criticisms being voiced amidst a deteriorating relationship. Little by little, he became tougher and tougher to work with. After a while he'd say to me, "Gee Stan, I don't like those plots you are writing for Spider-Man." So I'd say okay, because I couldn't have cared less. Steve was so good at drawing stuff. I said, "Use your own plot, I'll put the dialogue in." Then he'd say, "I don't like the sound effects you're putting in," so I told him to use his own. I didn't mind. I'd bend over backwards to accommodate him, because he was so good and the strip was so successful. While credits are not mentioned in his accounts, Lee did recall sensing a more general, underlying anger on Ditko's behalf that was never articulated. Little by little I noticed that Steve was beginning to give off hostile vibes. At first I thought it was my imagination, but after a while I realized that something was bugging him. Steve wasn't the most communicative guy in the world, and to this day I'm not quite sure what the problem was. It just seemed to me that he had a growing resentment toward me and the work I did, particularly in connection with Spider-Man. Whether Ditko expressed his frustrations over the credits directly to Lee, or chose to remain silent, will probably never be known for certain. Regardless, his commentaries show that he wanted credit acknowledging his creative contributions, without any implication that he was following a writer's script. In one of his later essays, Ditko even provided an example of what he would have found acceptable as a formal credit. In doing so, he retained the broad labels of artist and writer for himself and Lee, but excluded any reference to scripts or plots. Instead, his solution introduced new wording to emphasize that the strip was a co-creation. In explaining his rationale, Ditko employed a simple analogy: his collaboration with Stan Lee at Marvel was like combining oxygen and hydrogen to create water. Both components were essential to the creative process, and neither could be solely credited for the outcome.